This episode is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website, portfolio, and online store. For a free trial and 10% off, visit squarespace.com and enter offer code EXPERT at checkout. A better web starts with your website.
The podcast where we talk to smart people, but not necessarily done by smart people.
That is an awesome question.
This one goes down probably on one of my top 5.
Hey, I like nutrition. I like to eat food. This is the coolest thing ever. We're going to do this forever.
I wish I paid more attention in that class.
You know, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand that. As a man, I don't get it.
Welcome to smartpeoplepodcast.com.
Hello and welcome to Smart People Podcast, conversations that satisfy your curious mind. Chris Stemp and John Rojas here. Thanks for tuning in. Guys, this is all I have to say to you. Learn or die. Seriously, that is the title of the book written by our guest this week, Edward Hess. Ed is a professor of business administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and the author of 11 books, including his most recent Learn or Die, Using Science to Build a Leading-Edge Learning Organization. We do talk about organizations and why they need to foster this environment of learning and growth and screwing up and learning from that. But we also talk about, as an individual, how do you become a better learner? Why is it so important? What are the things you need to do to be more competitive and just to be a better person, right? Today in our crazy environment. Ed uses his 25 years of research in the fields of behavioral economics, neuroscience, and psychology to reveal advances in our understanding of the individual human learner and type of work environment that best enables those capabilities. So much fun, so on par with the message of Smart People Podcast. I loved it. Made me feel good about trying to be a learner, and I know that you are sitting there going, yeah, this is the stuff I believe in. That's why I listen to the podcast and do what you do. So appreciate that. Head on over to smartpeoplepodcast.com. We got new posts every week where we kind of highlight the quotes that we found most interesting, the things we learned. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which thanks to everybody who's signing up. We love keeping in touch with you. I want to apologize. I know we sent 2 newsletters on one day, and last week, that's my bad. So here it is. Hope you get a lot from this interview. I'm going to turn it over to Edward Hess. Ed, thanks so much for being on the show. Really excited to talk to you because, as we were kind of just discussing prior to the interview, your focus is on learning. And that's what you teach. That's what you just wrote a book about, Learn or Die, Using Science to Build a Leading-Edge Learning Organization. And I find the fact that you put a learning organization in there extremely unique. And as you know, this podcast is based around learning. And so I'm just so interested to learn more about what you do and your expertise and why you do it.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to all your listeners for listening to us.
Absolutely, and I'm also excited to talk to a fellow Virginian, if you will. I know you are a professor at Darden School of Business at University of Virginia, which is I know this because I grew up not too far from UVA. It's a state school. Everybody kind of knows the differences. UVA is a fantastic, nationally recognized, fantastic school, especially their School of Business.
Well, you're kind. You're kind.
First, I want to talk about, I know you teach business administration, and I wanted to talk about kind of how you got into that. What drew you to it? Were you always interested in this concept of learning, or was it some other way that you kind of got into this field?
That's a good question. Well, first, I spent about 30 years in the business world before going to academia. And during that time, I had 2 different forays, if you will, into psychology. My undergraduate work, I spent a lot of time in educational psychology, and I was very fortunate to be at a state school in the South that had a preeminent professor, Art Combs, and that I studied under. And he basically had trained with Carl Rogers, and he was one of the leading lights, if you will, in educational psychology and if you will, learner-centric learning. And I was going on from undergraduate school and get PhD in psychology, and I got very involved in a presidential campaign of a candidate, and that led me to the decision that I needed to go to law school, and I came to the University of Virginia Law School, and that took me to Wall Street to practice law, and ultimately took me to Wall Street in investment banking. And along that journey, I took a detour and decided I really wanted to go back to psychology, and I was accepted into a very good cognitive psychology graduate program. And so I went back to psychology and fueled my love of cognitive psychology and learning, and basically I was looking at decision making and judgment, and decided at one point in that I missed the business world, and I came back to the business world, but didn't lose my love for cognitive psychology and how we learn and how we think, and that was sort of involved, stayed in the background through my business career. And I joined academia 13 years ago, and one of the first things I wanted to do, I'd spent my part of my life in investment banking and strategy consulting, and I really felt like how people make decisions, and basically that bad decisions and bad business decisions and companies failing, so much of it depended on how people thought and their thinking, and whether they continued to learn or whether they were arrogant, had fixed mindsets, etc. So I stayed with it, and when I got back into academia, I got into it through my study of organic growth, innovation, and in effect the role of learning and innovation, and reached the point where I said I need to go back and revisit all of the science of learning and think about how it would fit in the business world today, because there hadn't been in my judgment, a good learning organization book written since 1990, when Peter Senge wrote his landmark book, The Fifth Dimension. So, long-winded answer, but it's been a journey of years where cognitive psychology and learning has been a passion of mine, and I've been able to, thankfully, with a lot of research funding, to spend the last several years, really focusing on what this book is all about, is how, in effect, how can you and I become a better learner, and how can an organization, if you will, create an environment where its people can be better and faster learners, because I firmly believe that learning in most businesses may be the only sustainable competitive advantage.
Right. Yeah. And I can't wait to talk about that. But first, from all the things I heard, so you have a PhD in psychology.
No, I did not finish I came back to the business world because I missed it.
Okay.
I didn't finish my PhD.
I was trying to figure out, that's a lot of stuff, but you went for your PhD, law school, Wall Street for law, and then the investment banking side. A lot of work in cognitive psychology, and then politics as well. That's an extremely broad and interesting. I think you covered almost every area that one day I wish to cover. So I can see how our interests align. And I also wonder, there can be a lot of anxiety when you have that many different interests. When you're really curious and you want to learn, everything's interesting. So what it seems like you just said, you know what, I'm interested in that. I'm going to work hard at that. And you let your passions, your curiosity guide you. Is that kind of a way you feel like you've gotten to where you are and the way you've lived?
That's a very astute question, because first, some people look at my background and say, gosh, you couldn't figure out what you wanted to be when you grew up. Others say you're a curious fellow. So there's two sides to that coin. But Chris, it's very interesting, because I was a lawyer, and I went into investment banking and became a senior partner in an investment banking firm. And to be honest, I didn't know how to do an internal rate of return computation. But the CEO that hired me knew me personally, and he said, the one thing I know about you is you know what you don't know, and you know how to learn. And so, he says, jump in the pool. And so much of my life has been jumping in the pool. And somewhere along the way, I learn to recognize quickly what I don't know that I needed to know, and I was able to learn it. And after you do that 2-3 times, you become more comfortable in the unknown and the uncertain and with the ambiguity, and you sort of have a modus operandi. I'm going into a new situation. I need to listen a lot. I need to ask a lot of questions. I need to figure out what's really important that I need to know, and I need to figure out how to go learn it. And that sort of, if you will, has been my operating system, and so far it's worked. And I think the key is I just was open to, okay, I don't know, but I can learn.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point. And again, it seems like you're taking so many words almost out of my brain, because I've been in a lot of careers already in about a decade, and I enjoy change, but I get nervous with new jobs. Am I going to be good at this? Are people going to realize how much I don't know? But the more you do it, that exposure, as what they talk about with fear and all those things, the more you do it, the more you understand I'll be okay. I've continued to succeed going this far. Yes. And I feel like you got comfortable with that. What advice do you have for people, actually, because you said you became comfortable in that unknown, but oftentimes it's some people can take it, I know I still probably do, can take it as a negative when they realize how little they know. How do you get comfortable with the fact that there's some things you just don't understand?
Well, I think it goes back, and I understand completely why most people feel, or a lot of people may feel uncomfortable, because if you think about our educational system and how we are raised, you're supposed to get all A's. You're not supposed to make mistakes. It's the system sort of penalizes the acknowledgement of ignorance. And you look at every great scientist, and you talk to scientists. That basically ignorance is a requirement in order to be a great scientist, because if you knew everything, you wouldn't have anything to go look for. And so I think we need a definition. I think I created, and I think what we need in this country is a different definition for what being smart is. Being smart is not the amount of what you know. It's not being right all the time. It's not being the first one with the right answer. It's really knowing what you know, but more importantly, knowing what you don't know and knowing how to learn it. And we've got to, people have to decouple their ego from what they believe, so that they're still willing to go out and, what I say, stress test it against better evidence, continue to learn, don't have a fixed mindset, don't basically be rigid and closed-minded. Treat everything you think you know as conditional, subject to new evidence. Now, I'm not talking about values, I'm talking about what we know. And to try and stay open-minded, and to not be defensive when you're challenged. And so we don't really do a good job in this country of teaching that in schools. Therefore, when people get into companies, they really don't do a good job with that. And that's one of the big things that has to change in the business environment that we're fixing to go into with advanced technology. And so the answer, the answer I would give you is sit back and think about what's your definition of being smart. If it's always having to be right, there's no way that's going to be, this image in the country we have of a great leader is the person who knows the most. No, I think a great leader is a leader who knows what he or she doesn't know, and is able to inspire lots of other people to admit their ignorance, and they go on a learning journey. And that journey is full of experimentation and innovation and trying things, and they just keep working at it hard day in and day out. And so I think that we need to change our definition of what smart is.
One thing you pointed out in your book is you talk about how humans can be lazy thinkers. I love the idea of that. And it was one of those things that after I read that, I said, well, that's kind of common sense. But I don't think, actually, I bet you would be willing to say it's a bias of ours, right? It's a cognitive bias that we don't recognize that until it's pointed out. And only then, if we're willing to understand how we don't like to be challenged, and we will figure out ways to support our current line of thought.
Yes, you're exactly right. I mean, if you really wanted to summarize how most of us think most of the time, first, we're on autopilot, and two, we're one big confirmation machine. We basically prioritize cognitively processing information which confirms what we already believe. And we operate really, we're fast reflexive thinkers. And Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, used the term, the lazy thinking, laziness is built deeply into our nature. And, it's interesting. I was doing a consulting project last week with 75 executives of a public company on this topic. And it was interesting. I asked them to define what thinking was and how do they know when they're thinking and how do they know when their thinking is good. And and they came up, and these are smart, successful people. They said, well, it just sort of happens. And that's the automatic pilot type of thing. And so really the whole concept of learning means you have to be open to new information, which changes your mental models. You continually, if you will, adjust your mental models to the reality, to truth. And most people find, don't even realize that. And so it's not just the cognitive. I mean, the science of learning doesn't paint a pretty picture of us as humans. We're cognitively confirmation machines, emotionally, rationality. I mean, the science says rationality is a myth. Emotions are wrapped and intertwined in almost every step of our cognitive processing. Just like we're a confirmation machine cognitively, emotionally, we're inclined to defend what we think and protect our ego and self-image. So cognitively, we seek to confirm, and emotionally, we seek to defend. And in order to be a really good critical thinker or to be really good at innovation, you've got to basically overcome those natural proclivities. And the difficulty, Chris, is it's very hard for any one individual to do that by him or herself.
I'm so glad you said that.
It takes others.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I realize one of the reasons why I think the learning, the cognitive, emotional parts that are so difficult for us is because we don't want to deal with the struggle of flipping our world upside down, right? Something we've always taken for granted. We don't want to prove ourselves wrong on that because then we have to question so many other things. We might have to look deeper at so many things, and life's complicated enough as it is. So I think what you mentioned is sometimes it helps to have that reflective person on your side that can at least guide you through that process.
Well, I agree with you. And I think I'd even be a little stronger. It's almost necessary in most cases. And I think the research basically says, it's very hard for us to overcome by ourselves our confirmation bias. It's much easier to identify other people's, Daniel Kahneman said this, it's much easier to identify other people's thinking mistakes than our own. And Nobel laureate Herbert Simon, I was reading his autobiography the other day, and he had an interesting statement, and I'm sure you know who Herbert Simon was. He was one of the early artificial intelligence and machine learning people, the Nobel laureate in economics, one of the founders of Carnegie Mellon's Business School. And he had a great line in his book that he said, we tend to think people who agree with us are much more intelligent than those who disagree with us.
I love it.
And he also had a line that business principles, we all know what the best business principles are. He says, but they rarely are put in place. And he said business principles, just like Christianity, are rarely realized because of our human thinking weaknesses and our lack of self-management. And that's why it takes other people, and that's why the environment in taking other people, in order for me to learn from you, I have to trust you. I have to emotionally feel comfortable with you and that you're not going to do me harm. And so if you think about it in the business world, where it's generally some organizations are organized and they create competition between employees, if you think about it, those type of environments are not conducive to real constructive collaboration and egoless collaboration, which you need in order to really constantly challenge what you think and come up with what is the best evidence-based answer.
You know, the person that put that so clear for me was Simon Sinek. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but recently, not his first one, but the most recent book and TED Talk he gave was about how fear in an organization is the number one destructor of growth, and how it has to encompass every single employee. Because if people are just worried about how they appear, how they're going to be rated in their evaluation, if they're going to keep their job, they're completely unwilling to step outside of any constraints. So that's why you get people on the phone, you know, the customer service that can't stray from a script, as opposed to Zappos, for example. We interviewed the CEO, Tony Hsieh, and he says, listen, I hire smart people, I give them the basic guidelines, but then I let them use their very capable brain to answer these questions, and it provides for a much better experience. And he has therefore taken the fear out of the organization and instilled a sense of understanding, trial and error.
I couldn't agree more, and that's why I come down real strong in the book with the point that in order to be a high-performance learning organization, a leading-edge learning organization, it's got to be a positive emotional work environment that results in high employee engagement, and it cannot be a culture of fear. And it basically, that means it's not going to be what Douglas McGregor called Theory X leadership, command and control, and a non-humanistic view of people. I mean, if you really, a company that's really a great learning organization is a humanistic company. It's a company, if you will, where it has to be emotionally robust, because you've got to overcome the defensiveness and the fear of failure, the fear of looking bad, the fear of losing your job. And you're not going to do that unless you trust people and trust the environment. And what that means is it takes in organizations a different definition of mistakes than what exists today. Now, I'm not talking about mistakes where you lose billions of dollars. I'm talking about, we'll call it normal mistakes. And if you look at great learning organizations, they accept mistakes as learning opportunities. So the environment that we have in the corporate world today, that's why I feel so strongly to bring the science of learning into the business world today is going to require most companies to transform themselves.
That's what I want to get into next, the science of learning specifically within organizations. The one thing that your recent comment brought up for me was, and I can't remember where I heard it, but I heard somebody say that organizations, when they evaluate their employees, should really, aside from all the things they're doing, they should say, what 5 things did you try this year or this quarter or whatever it might be that didn't work? Because at least that means they're trying things that can grow the organization. Because if you don't have those, then you're not trying hard enough. And I just thought, man, that's really insightful.
You know, I've spent a lot of time the last 10 years inside of companies working on organic growth strategies, cultures, processes, doing experiments, and teaching companies how to do experiments. And I think that I've come to the conclusion that not only is fear one of the biggest inhibitors of learning in organizations, in public companies, short-termism is as big an inhibitor of learning. Too many companies are just the internally driven to quarter earnings. And when you look at the statistics in public companies today, the average CEO's tenure is 4.6 years. And you look at the volatility that exists in the corporate world driven through our capital markets. And it's a rare company that basically says, look, we're going to try and do a lot of experiments. A lot of them are not going to work out, but you've got to be in us for the long term. And I mean, if you go back and look at Amazon and read Amazon's annual report every year from the time it went public, Jeff Bezos finishes with the same last sentence or paragraph every time. We are in it for the long term. We're going to try a lot of things. They're not all going to work. I'm paraphrasing. And if you're not in it for the long term, we're not the company for you.
Makes a lot of sense.
And so you're exactly right. But what it takes is a company that's got a long-term view and realizes that, especially when you're talking about trying new things, you've got companies, you've got two different tolerances for failure. You've got operational excellence, which is 99% defect-free in organizations. And then when you really get to innovation and trying new things, the failure rate in most companies is 90% or more. And the conundrum is for companies to be able to have a learning environment with two different tolerances and two different measurement systems depending on the activity and two different basically tolerances for failure.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I'm a big sports fan, and it reminds me of sports coaches. I'm thinking of the Redskins in particular because we're in Virginia and they're my team. But I don't know, they have something like 10 coaches in the past 15 years or something insane. And each one kind of talks about what they're going to bring to the table and how they're going to rebuild the organization or the team. And then they're fired within a year or two because they don't produce results. And all that leads to is a coach coming in and thinking, how can I do something great this year? And oftentimes that's almost impossible. You have to look towards the draft, what positions you have to fill gaps in, where you can learn throughout this season. Because if all you're thinking is, how am I going to keep my job? And this goes in for organizations as well, then you're not even going to pay attention to what went wrong because all you want to do is get the necessary amount of things right to keep that.
Right. In the environment business, I mean, we live in a business environment today that's characterized by volatility, change, ambiguity, the pace of change driven by technology primarily. Globalization also plays a part, but primarily by technology. The pace of change in the next 10 years is going to increase dramatically because of artificial intelligence. And basically, the company of the future is going to be staffed by some combination of smart robots, artificially intelligent smart machines, and humans. And the humans are going to be doing what the technology can't do well. And that's basically complex critical thinking, innovative thinking, and high emotional engagement with other humans. And if you think about it, going to what we're talking about, really and truly, technology is going to basically drive operational excellence, and humans are going to drive innovation. Innovation, you've got to have the right environment and be a learning organization, basically, in order to compete in that environment. And so the changes that are coming are going to move in the direction that you're talking about, and it's going to challenge many, many businesses, and companies are going to need a blueprint for how to do all of that, and that's really one of the purposes of the book. But the point I'm making here for our listeners and everything, we're fixing to, over the next 10 to 15 years, enter an environment of technology change, which makes everything up to now look simple. And we're all going to have to take our learning game to a higher level, all us humans, because we're going to have new people to compete against. We're just not competing against humans. We're going to be competing against smart machines and smart robots, depending on what your job is. So we've got to take our learning game up, and organizations have got to take their learning game up in order to compete and in that environment, because the technology is going to basically be, except for the algorithms, is going to be a commodity.
We'll be right back to this interview after a quick word from our sponsors.
This week, our sponsor is Squarespace, and I'm sure you've heard me say it before, but honestly, Squarespace is hands down the best way to make a website these days. It is an all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website, portfolio, or online store. I've talked about this so many times, but I am terrible at the whole website making. I don't really understand it, but I have used Squarespace and built a number of sites, one for a friend who's gone on to do thousands of dollars in business for her photography business. I've done my own website. It's so easy. They do drag and drop. There's 24/7 support through live chat and email. So I run into some snags just because I don't know what I'm doing. And you can just pull out a chat, like an instant message, and they will figure it out. They've done it a number of times. And plans start at just $8 a month, which includes a free domain name. Whether you want to sell something online, do a blog, whatever it might be, Squarespace allows for all of that capability and functionality. Start a trial with no credit card required and start building your website today. Squarespace is giving Smart People Podcast listeners a special deal. So when you decide to sign up for Squarespace, make sure to go to squarespace.com and use the offer code EXPERT to get 10% off your first purchase. And it'll show your support for Smart People Podcast. Squarespace, a better web starts with your website. That brings up a good point. How, given that you've done so much studying on the science of learning in regards to both individuals and organizations, I'm wondering for individuals, myself, listeners, how do we take our learning to the next level? How do we prepare ourselves for this coming trend?
Good question. I think the first place we have to start is we got to accept the science of learning. And we've talked about that. We got to accept the fact we're fast, reflexive, lazy thinkers. We're confirmation machines, and emotionally, we're defensive thinkers. Okay? If you don't accept that, you're not going to get to, if you will, the next step. We've talked about the definition of being smart. We got to decouple our beliefs from our ego, and we got to basically define ourselves not by what we know, but whether we use best critical thinking, innovative thinking, listening, collaborating practices. So how we process this. So we've got to take our game to the next level. We've got to learn and rigorously use daily best practices for critical thinking, innovative thinking, collaborating, managing ourselves. We got to actually grade ourselves daily. And what that requires for most of us, since in order to do that, we've already talked about, it generally occurs in teams. We've got to develop our emotional intelligence. We've got to basically develop our ability to be aware of how we're thinking and when we need to take it to a higher level. We've got to start talking differently. We basically got to ask ourselves, why do I believe that? What assumptions am I making? What facts do I have to justify those assumptions? Do I have enough credible evidence to believe what I believe? I've got to go ask somebody, hey, this is what I think. What am I missing? I've got to voluntarily seek constructive feedback. And when somebody's giving me feedback, I've got to learn to actually listen non-judgmentally. Listen and not formulate my answer while he or she are talking, all right? And actually be open-minded to consider that. That requires us to manage our emotions and that fear of looking stupid, that fear of making a mistake. We've got to be comfortable with our ignorance. We got to be comfortable. And so what do we need to do? We got to change our mindset about being smart, about ignorance. We got to learn processes. We got to use them. And then we've got to develop our emotional intelligence so that we can develop our mindfulness, empathy, and humility. And to be a great learner, you've got to have empathy, you've got to have humility, and you've got to have great mindfulness, paying attention to how you think, how your emotions are, and how other people's emotions are. And all this takes hard work. There's no easy, you go on a journey, and I have to be, brutally honest with you. When I got deeply into this research, it was a wake-up call for me. I had to come to the personal realization I had to take my learning game to a higher level, and my goodness, I had a lot of stuff I needed to work on. Okay, I was that kid who grew up in the rural South, and I was not an athlete, so my ego was all around being the smartest kid in the class, and that meant raising my hand the fastest, and that means interrupting the teacher, and that means not listening to other people. And and that worked for a lot of years. But that doesn't work in the world today, because knowledge is being created so fast and there's so much I don't know. So I had to basically work on my listening. I had to basically learn how to quiet my ego. I had to basically create some checklists that I use before each meeting, and critical thinking checklist and questions. And I grade myself each day. And I've been doing this now for, a year and a half. And am I a better learner now than I was before I started this book? Yes, but I still got a lot of work to do. And we all have got to get to that point of what we work on stuff. It's very interesting.
And I know we're getting short on time, but I wanted to touch on the organization as well, because it's different. You have structures in place. There's a culture. You need to look at leadership. And I was wondering, we talked about fear, but what can leaders do to really encourage learning, to make it a place where their employees can survive, can thrive? Because, as always, they're looking at the bottom line. And so how do they look at both? Because seemingly they're different. I understand they're linked, very intertwined. But seemingly, if you spend 5 hours of an employee just doing some learning, that's 5 hours they're not working towards your bottom line directly.
Yep, all good questions. And one of the good things that I did in the book is bring 4, 5 companies into the book, different levels of detail, who have been engaged on this journey. And they're all different, and there's no one way to do this. If you're gonna build what I call a learning system, first you have to define the learning behaviors you want, and then you have to create the environment that encourages those behaviors, and you put in processes, but you got to actually measure and reward those behaviors. And what it takes is a culture of candor, where people can be honest, permission to speak freely. People can question, they can critique. Mistakes are learning opportunities. It takes the rigorous use of best practices. Take Intuit Inc. Intuit started about 7 years ago. Very successful company, very profitable company. But the founder, Scott Cook, felt like we need to take our game to a higher level, and he wanted to transform the company into a higher level learning organization, a culture of experimentation and innovation. And it's in the book has a chapter on their story and what they did. And what's interesting is how they started with the leadership, because he knew that leaders had to change their mindsets and their behaviors in order for it to work, because they had to role model it. And they came up with a saying that it's time to bury Caesar. No more can we be a top-down, only senior leadership makes decisions, and decisions are basically made based on PowerPoints, and we'll call it the usual corporate stuff. And it's like, and they basically went on a journey that basically empowered every employee and gave them permission to go do small experiments and taught everybody how to do experiments. And but it's interesting there where they focused on the fact that leaders have to change. And what's fascinating in that chapter is how Scott Cook talks about his first 360-degree review and what he had to work on, and what the CEO, Brad Smith, talks about how he spends his time as a CEO and what percent of it is actually going out in the world and learning. And so interesting. When you look, there's another company which I don't have in the book because of space, Pixar Animated Studios. Fascinating company. Whole culture of candor. Whole culture built around our mental models are not reality. Think about that. Our mental models are not reality. What we believe, our stories of the world, are not reality. They're our stories, just like I have my story, Chris, you have yours. And Pixar is a great company to learn from. W.L. Gore and Associates, fascinating company. Okay, they structure themselves in small business units. Generally, a business unit or operation doesn't have more than 250 people, so it's possible to have personal engagement in sort of everybody generally knows everybody. Every employee, and they have 10,000 employees, every employee at Gore has a personal mentor for their development, their personal development, all right? And development is all what we're talking about. That mentor, a big part of his or her annual review is how well their mentees are doing. At W.L. Gore, you are only appointed a leadership position if others want to follow you. All, if you will, all of these companies are doing things differently than what I'd call the traditional management practice coming out of the Industrial Revolution. In the learning company of the future, hierarchy will exist. There'll be different titles, but fundamentally hierarchy and structure has to change. The whole role modeling of these behaviors, leaders are going to have to be authentic, human, okay? Leaders are going to get emotional coaching. They've got to exhibit mindfulness and empathy and humility. I mean, that's a big change for a lot of leaders. So the other thing that the book does is it spends about 50 pages on the most advanced learning organization that I found. That's Bridgewater Associates, the biggest hedge fund in the world. And they have a culture and an entire system designed to help people mitigate their closed-mindedness, their intellectual arrogance, and their ego defenses. And learning is so key. The key there is how fast are you learning? And it's got candor, permission to speak freely, transparency, authenticity, same rules for everybody. Every one of these companies does some things very, very well. There's no perfect company, but these people are working at it, and it takes time. Intuit's been at it 7 years, for example, in their transformation. So there's places to go look and learn. And another place to look is a very large organization which has been on the forefront of learning for years, and that's the U.S. Army. In 2011, the Army came out with their Army Learning Concept 2015, and it's all about critical thinking. And the U.S. Army now has a major initiative where their comprehensive fitness concept, where they're training 1 million soldiers in psychological strength and positive performance, and it's basically emotional intelligence training and positive psychology training. And so if an organization with 1 million employees is into what you and I are talking about, I can tell you that everybody is going to be pushed there because of technology.
I didn't imagine this question coming to me, but I have to ask it. Aside from technology, why is it so important that we question everything, that we continue so hard to stay ahead of the curve? Why can't you just say, you know what, instead of hiring people and encouraging them to learn, I'm going to hire already really, and I don't want to say smart, but just experienced people and tell them to do their job really well. And that will give us our step ahead. That'll give us our bottom line.
Well, first, it depends on your business model. Is your business model based on operational excellence, or does your business model have a heavy component of innovation or a heavy component of high emotional engagement with employees? So let's say, you want to go hire smart people. It's different types of smartness for operational excellence than it is for innovation, than it is for high emotional engagement or emotional intelligence. So first, it's, figuring out what type of smarts you need, and then figuring out, okay, are these people great learners, or were these people in a system where the system drove the performance and they had to basically manage variance? And in most operational excellence organization, managers, leaders, basically they get up in the morning and what they look for is variance, and they want to get rid of variance. So, you really, I think you really you ask a good question. If your hiring practices are sophisticated enough that you can identify, just like the question you asked me, 20 minutes ago, all right, on the, what's the 5 things you worked on this year that didn't work? If you have got the right hiring processes and the right testing processes, and you can hire people with what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset, and people that are curious, are willing to explore and take risk, but have an open mind. If you can find them, you ought to hire all of them you can.
It makes a lot of sense.
Makes a lot of sense.
I love that. Well, Ed,
but what you got, Chris, what you got to make sure is that the environment that you have, that you're bringing them into, doesn't squelch them.
Right.
You got to make sure you got your house in order. And you know what? When you get your house in order, Chris, the amazing thing is you can't become complacent. You got to work at it every day, because you got to fight arrogance and complacency and ego and fear cropping in. I mean, everybody, whether it's Ray Dalio at Bridgewater or the CEO of Pixar or even IDEO. IDEO has a great learning culture, and they have very bright people, and they have an interesting philosophy. They want their people to fail real fast when they come in, because most of these very smart people have never failed at anything in their life, because failure makes you humble.
Yeah, and it's one of those things so hard to deal with, but that's why it makes you humble.
Well, but if you understand, if you accept the fact you don't know everything, if you understand in order to learn, you're going to make mistakes, that basically most learning occurs through mistakes. It's interesting. Intuit, in order to make it easier for people to deal with, they sort of call their mistakes surprises. So they ask somebody, what surprised you? Instead of what did you learn from your mistakes?
That's genius. That's genius. I love that.
So what surprised you? And so looking for surprises and being open to surprises. It's really, as you can tell, I feel passionately about this. This is really interesting stuff.
Absolutely. Well, and it's
all tied up. Really, if you get down to it, all tied up into emotions and in having real relationships in work and trusting relationships. I trust you, Chris, that when you're giving me feedback, you really don't want to do me harm. You're giving me feedback because you care about me as a person, and I'll do the same to you. And that's why transparency and authenticity politically in an organization, and in most organizations I've worked with, Chris, if you and I are in the same place, I like you, Chris, and everything, but, I don't want you looking too good, because, there's only going to be so many slots.
Sure.
And you and I are ultimately competing for the same slot, but I like you a lot, my friend, but gee whiz, I don't want to like you too much.
Ed, again, I really appreciate it. And I wanted to see, for those that are interested in your work, your writing, this topic, is there anywhere you could recommend our listeners go? Do you have a website, or is there a special place you want to recommend?
On this topic, the Batten Institute, which is the institute at Darden Business School, which is the institute where innovation and entrepreneurship is headquartered, has a website for my book. It has blogs I've written about the book. It's got short YouTube, 2 to 3 minute summaries of each chapter in the book, and then if people have interest in, there's also they can then go from there to other information, which has other work that I've done over the years. And the other thing is, it's pretty easy to Google me, and people will see what I've been working on over the past 5 to 7 years.
Absolutely. Well, Ed, thank you again so much for taking this much time out of your night. I really appreciate it and look forward to learning more about it.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the good conversation, and I look forward to learning from you. I just got my first newsletter tonight, and so it was a great learning opportunity that we got connected, and wish you all the best on your learning journey.
Welcome back. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with Ed Hess. Learn or Die. I love the message of that this week. And Ed's book, Learn or Die, Using Science to Build a Leading Edge Learning Organization. It's a fantastic book, definitely worth the read. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the growth mindset. I believe that anybody can learn anything, so knowing that moving forward, I think really will open our eyes and make us all become better learners. If you guys enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a rating, review, and comment there. That truly does help us out, and we really do appreciate when you guys take the time and leave something there for us so we can see some feedback and so the guests can see, hey, this is a legitimate show. I'd love to be on it. We've mentioned it a few times, but we do have Smart People Podcast stickers. If you want one of those, just reach out to us on Twitter at SmartPeoplePod or shoot us an email at smartpeoplepodcast@gmail.com. We'll get your address and send you a sticker or two your way. And if you want to stay in touch with all things Smart People Podcast related, head over to the website, smartpeoplepodcast.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you will see what we're up to, what we're reading, what we're learning, all that good stuff about every 2 or 3 weeks. Stay tuned for another great episode of Smart People Podcast, and we'll see you guys next week.